I'm really lucky to be following Lauren. Maybe I can convince those of you who are convinced by Lauren to add yet another kind of constraint, the metaphysical sort. Just a little bit of background about this talk. There's a sort of cottage industry in metaphysics, where metaphysicians essentially send raiding parties into philosophy of science to bring back interesting ideas that they might be able to use to understand things that they're interested in with respect to grounding and essence. So many philosophers interested in metaphysical explanation are compelled by a kind of symmetry between explanation and science, and we might want to say in this crowd, alleged explanation and metaphysics. So explanation in terms of grounding is meant to be built on a kind of model of causation or causal explanation. And we can talk a little bit more about how that sort of mapping is meant to work. People like David Kovacs have been working out unificationist accounts of metaphysical explanation. And there's a lot of recent talk about metaphysical laws and explanations in terms of those laws. I find this kind of symmetry illuminating. It has its limitations, but I think it's interesting to see how far it goes. And today I want to do two things. I want to draw on some earlier work to develop a notion of metaphysical explanation by constraint. That's in some ways similar to the notion we've been thinking about, especially the Lang version of it, of scientific explanation by constraint. And then second, I want to suggest that the distinction between constraint and coincidence that's central to explanation by constraint is getting overlooked in a way that makes trouble for a prominent account of laws for metaphysical explanation that's offered by Jonathan Schaffer, his functional conception. So in short, I'm going to argue that laws require more structure than Jonathan Schaffer allows. So the plan is to start off by just introducing scientific explanation by constraint. We can go quite quickly through this since you all have done a lot of work here. And then I want to try to extend the notion to metaphysics. I'm going to offer some examples of purported metaphysical explanations by constraint. A tempting thing to do at this point would be to try to understand MEC's metaphysical explanations by constraint in terms of grounding, which is the sort of main tool in this area. I think, though, that that kind of approach is going to fail. And so we need an account of these kinds of explanations. I'll offer one quickly, and then I'll use the sort of operative notion or distinction between constraint and coincidence to raise trouble for that functional conception of laws. I think that it's actually important to begin when we're talking about constraint and coincidence with the sort of distinction from people like Salmons between bottom-up and top-down explanations. I take it that this is familiar from the literature and scientific explanation. So I also think it's useful to distinguish explanations in terms of their sources of explanatory power. So I'll talk in those terms. That in mind, bottom-up scientific explanations seem to be getting their power by giving information about their particular processes by which their targets were produced, or maybe sets of events that made a difference with respect to their occurrence. So paradigm cases of these sorts of things are like causal mechanical explanations that give information about causal mechanisms or difference makers. For example, if we want to know why the salt dissolves in water, we might say, well, what made that occur is that charged bits of the water molecules pull chlorine atoms off salt crystals and into the solution. And that's what causes the salt to dissolve in water. Bottom-up explanations are essentially particular, I think, so that individual occurrences are fundamental. And we explain generalizations in terms of these particular occurrences. So we might be able to make claims about why salt generally dissolves in water. But these sorts of claims are going to bottom out in particular instances of that solution or dissolution. So in contrast with bottom-up explanations, top-down explanations essentially go in the other direction. They explain by subsuming their targets under extremely general principles, by fitting particular occurrences into the universal scheme of things. Maybe the most familiar sort of top-down explanation is the unificationist one. And so I'll borrow an example from Kitcher in a minute. For example, we might want to know why neon is chemically inert. And we might explain, well, neon is chemically inert because it has a full outermost electron shell. And the idea here is that rather than providing a description of the causal processes and various samples of neon that caused it to be inert, we're subsuming the behavior of our sample of neon under a unified account on which the chemical behavior of all elements is explained in terms of their number of valence electrons. So here and in general, top-down explanations subsume particular targets under more general principles. And although they might cite causes, they don't need to cite causes. So although unificationist explanations are the most familiar, I think, sort of top-down explanation, we can add to the pile scientific explanations by constraint. And I have Lang's sense in mind here in particular. So scientific explanations by constraint are meant to explain their targets by showing that they follow from, Lang says, great general principles, so that they must be the case. Lang couches this in terms of necessity or counterfactual stability. But the idea here is that constraints are more necessary than and so more general than their targets. There are lots of different instances of this, but we might think that natural laws can constrain instances of those laws, that meta laws constrain the laws, that mathematical facts can constrain contingent ones. I have two examples of scientific explanation by constraint, both from Lang and both, I think, familiar at this point. They've been discussed in other talks. So for example, Lang says that gravitational and electrical interactions both conserve energy because the law of energy conservation requires it. And the idea here is that the constraint, the conservation law, constrains the operation of every nomologically possible force law. It's not just a coincidence of the way the force laws, quote unquote, happen to be, so that each force law conserves energy each for its own reason. Instead, the conservation law is explanatorily prior to the conservation behavior of each force law. It sort of unifies the behavior all under a sort of single common explanation. So here's one, a distinctively mathematical one. Why does mother fail every time she tries to divide her 23 strawberries evenly among her 3 kids? Well, she fails because 23 can't be divided evenly into 3. So again, mother's failure isn't a coincidence. And if mother repeats her attempts, that repeated failure isn't a coincidence. Instead, it results from a constraint. The mathematical fact constrains the way any possible division attempt might go. It's explanatorily prior to mother's attempt. So it's worth saying that there are cases where a single fact can be explained both from the bottom up and from the top down, and this might be important later. Salmons' famous friendly physicist case is an example of this. So Salmons' physicist asks whether or why a helium balloon moves towards the front of a plane on takeoff, rather than you might expect towards the back of the plane, as we do when we accelerate. And there are 2 explanations we might give for this. One is a kind of bottom-up causal explanation. So we can imagine what happens to the parcel of air in the cabin as the plane accelerates for takeoff. Air molecules collide with the rear of the cabin as the rear moves forward. And that creates a kind of pressure gradient that acts on the balloon to push it towards the front of the plane. So we're describing the particular causal mechanism that gave rise to that behavior. But we could also give a top-down explanation in terms of Einstein's principle of equivalence. So the idea here is that acceleration and gravitation are physically equivalent, and so they're observationally indistinguishable. And so we should expect the balloon to behave just as it would if we stuck a gravitational field in the back of the plane. Because balloons, helium balloons, at least float in a gravitational field, a downward gravitational field, we should expect it to move towards the front of the plane as it accelerates for takeoff. So we have here the very same fact getting explained from the bottom up and from the top down. So the first thing that I want to do today is to try to extend this idea from philosophy of science into metaphysics. And I think that we don't need to do a ton of new work to extend the idea of bottom-up explanation to metaphysics. There's already some systematic structural analogies between causal explanations and grounding explanations. So it seems like grounding explanations are going to work from the bottom up. So grounding explanations seem to, you might say that if causal explanations govern the dynamics of the world, so the way that the world unfolds over time, then grounding governs the dynamics of the world as it unfolds from more fundamental things to less fundamental things. And so we can think in terms of metaphysical processes in the same way that we can think in terms of causal processes, where those metaphysical processes are governed by the operation of ground. And grounding explanations work by laying bare the particular metaphysical processes by which the more fundamental bits give rise to the less fundamental bits. So when people talk about ground, they use these sort of causative terms all the time. And they base models of grounding explanation on models of causal explanation, including interventionist models. So a lot of work has been done to describe grounding explanations And most of this work makes grounding explanations out to be similar to causal explanations, both working from the bottom up. But comparatively little work has been done on top-down metaphysical explanations. I think that there are top-down metaphysical explanations. I'm interested in the Unificationist project, but I also think that there are metaphysical explanations by constraint that are similar in some ways to the scientific explanations by constraint that we've been talking about. So I think the best way to sort of make the case here is to offer some examples and then to appeal to the intuitive similarity that these kinds of examples have to the sorts of cases we've been thinking of. So imagine that I'm not a very good housekeeper. I've left a bunch of dishes stacked up in my sink. And I'm considering what you might think of as a kind of skeptical possibility. So let's say that exactly the 5 dishes that are stacked in my sink form a new object. Let's call this new object stack. And now I'm wondering, well, why just one stack composed of exactly our 5 dishes? Why not 2 or 1,000 or whatever? And it's worth saying before we get any further into this, I should have mentioned it before, but that I don't mean to be committing myself to any of the metaphysics here. We might talk about whether or not these explanations are viable independently of whether or not we think composition is unique or whether there could be such objects as stacks or whether composition occurs at all. So I intend to bracket a lot of these sort of metaphysical questions in order to ask how that explanations would go, given that we're willing to grant the background assumptions here. And I think in the dishes case, if we want to explain why there can't be more than one distinct stack, then the example or the answer is straightforward, granting uniqueness. The fact that composition is unique explains why there are not 2 distinct stacks composed of exactly our 5 dishes. So uniqueness is a common claim to hear in mereology, where the idea is that composition is unique if for any composite objects x and y that have exactly the same proper parts, then x is identical with y. So if there's perfect overlap of proper parts, then there's identity. So I think in this explanation, there are 2 ways that we might understand uniqueness and what uniqueness is doing. One way that we could understand it is as a generalization. So the idea here is that uniqueness is a kind of generalization over lots of particular instances of composition, so that in each case, the dishes among them, we've got objects, and every object that shares exactly the same proper parts turns out to be identical. And because we see this pattern instantiated over and over again, we have the true generalization that composition is unique. And the standard sort of story about grounding generalizations, universal generalizations, is that these universal generalizations are grounded in their instances. So one way to understand uniqueness is to understand it as a generalization, as a kind of coincidence. But the other way to understand this, I'm sorry, my lights have just gone out. The other way to understand uniqueness is as a kind of constraint. So on this way of understanding it, uniqueness is prior to its instances rather than posterior to it. So I think that this explanation is only going to work if uniqueness is a constraint, and it's not going to work if uniqueness is a coincidence. So as a kind of generalization over instances, like I said, uniqueness is true in virtue of each particular instance of composition taken together. But if we have understood uniqueness in this way, then we get something that looks a whole lot like a tight explanatory circle. So we have that the dish is composed uniquely being a partial explanation for the fact that all instances of composition are unique. And then at the same time, we're using that generalization as the full explanation for the fact that the dishes fail to compose more than one distinct stack. So it's not exactly an explanatory circle, but it's far too close for comfort. So this line of objection might bring to mind the circularity objection to Humean laws. But it's worth pointing out that standard responses in that case don't work here. So in that case, it's familiar to claim that we actually have different senses of explanation going on. So we're metaphysically explaining generalizations, and then we're using the generalizations to scientifically explain instances. But in this case, it looks like metaphysical explanation, in fact, maybe grounding, is happening in both cases. And so it looks like this sort of explanation is just not going to work. So uniqueness is not going to be explanatory here if it's a mere coincidence. But I suggest that it is explanatory as long as we understand uniqueness as a metaphysical constraint. So one other case, and by the way, there are more cases, and not just cases having to do with mereology, but mereology is handy because they have a habit of naming principles. So if you're interested in hearing more cases, I'm happy to talk more about those in Q&A. But let's imagine a statue on the East Coast and a lump of clay on the West Coast. And we might wonder, well, why doesn't the West Coast lump constitute the East Coast statue? Well, the fact that constitution requires mereological overlap, maybe together with facts about the locations of these things, explains the fact that the statue is not constituted by the clay. And again, I think that we need to understand the mereological overlap condition as a constraint rather than a coincidence. But once we do, we get a sort of top-down explanation. So we're explaining the particular behavior of the East Coast statue and the West Coast lump by showing how this particular occurrence, this particular failure, fits into the universal scheme of things. So hopefully I've given you some examples that look at least suspiciously like explanations by constraint. And hopefully they look like genuine explanations to you. If you're a fan of grounding theory, you might be tempted at this point to try to describe explanations like dishes as grounding explanations. So again, that explanation is the fact that composition is unique explains the fact that there are not two distinct stacks composed of exactly our 5 dishes. I think that that's a bad idea for several reasons. First, I think that uniqueness doesn't seem like a ground to me for several reasons. So first, keep in mind that the kind of fact that we're trying to ground here, it's a negative fact, the fact that there are not 2 distinct stacks composed of exactly our 5 dishes. And the question of what grounds negative facts is really a fraught question. But I don't think that this explanation is similarly fraught. We might, for example, live options are that negative facts are totally ungrounded, that they're grounded in totality facts. None of those things seem very plausible here. So it looks like there's a kind of unclarity in the grounding story about negative facts, but no similar unclarity about the explanatory story with respect to this particular negative fact. And that suggests that we're not explaining by grounding here. I also think that we can get evidence against the grounding hypothesis by looking at the way in which we sort of acquire the concept of grounding. So one way that this is usually done is by looking at paradigmatic examples of grounding, like singleton Socrates being grounded in Socrates, or determinate properties like redness being grounded in determinants like being crimson. And it looks to me like the fact that composition is unique doesn't stand in the same kind of relationship to the fact that there are not 2 distinct stacks composed of exactly our 5 dishes. It's intuitively different from these paradigmatic relationships. And the bare intuition, even though it is a bare intuition of difference, seems to me comparably strong to the intuition of sameness that unites prototypical instances of grounding. Another bit of evidence we might get is coming from the kind of analogy or parallel to causation. So we're supposed to be able to describe all these instances of grounding in causative terms, like making the case or generating or producing. But those sorts of causative terms don't seem apt here. The fact that composition is unique doesn't seem to make the case or generate or bring about the fact that there are not 2 distinct stacks, except in maybe a very extended sense. So I don't think that this works like a grounding explanation. Suppose, though, that I'm wrong about all this. Suppose that there is a grounding explanation in terms of uniqueness that we could get here. Well, even then, I think that this sort of grounding explanation would need to treat uniqueness as a generalization, as a coincidence. And that would make the case that, like all grounding explanations, this one would work from the bottom up. It would describe the particular metaphysical mechanism that gave rise to the negative fact that we're interested in. And as a bottom-up explanation, I don't think that the grounding version of this explanation would be a genuine rival to the top-down metaphysical explanation by constraint that I've offered. So as we saw in Salmons' friendly physicist case, the very same fact can get both a top-down and a bottom-up explanation. And each of these kinds of explanations seems to bring about its own distinctive explanatory contribution. So even if we could give this sort of grounding explanation, an overlapping grounding explanation, I take that it would be a complement to the metaphysical explanation by constraint that I've tried to describe, rather than a sort of rival. So I don't think that metaphysical explanations by constraint are grounding explanations. It would be helpful to say a little bit about how I do think that they work. So one kind of natural candidate to raise would be the sort of modal account that Lang is interested in. And it's the account that we might be inclined towards if we're giving an account of scientific explanation by constraint. I think, though, that in the metaphysical case, talking about metaphysical constraints in terms of counterfactual stability is costly. So it requires the kinds of degrees of metaphysical modality that Eleanor Knox was worried about earlier in the talk. But this time it might be worse. We might need to be talking in terms of a hierarchy of nested counterpossibles rather than just counterfactuals. And we might find that those sorts of modal commitments are too costly. If you're worried about the modal commitments that Lang is making, you should be very, very worried about the modal commitments that this would sort of foist on you. More deeply, though, I take it that the modal stability account calls out for explanation. So that a story about which counterfactuals are more stable than which shouldn't be the end. We ought to explain why that counterfactual or counterpossible stability is distributed in the way that it does. So I take it that this kind of point is going to have dialectical force for people who are interested in grounding or metaphysical explanation by constraint, because a big part of this post-modal project is coming from a dissatisfaction with brute modal claims. It would be, I think, a problem to find ourselves falling back on those brute modal claims here. So instead, I'm interested in an essentialist account. So I think of constraint as a kind of functional role that's getting played. It might be played by lots of different things. And in the cases that we're interested in here, I think that this functional role is getting played by natures of things. And I'm happy with any sort of understanding of natures that doesn't boil them down to brute modality. So the idea here is that for some worldly fact F, and in any entity X, F is going to count as a metaphysical constraint on X, if and only if F is the case, F is the case is part of what it is to be X. So in other words, constraints are just constitutive bits of natures. So metaphysical explanations by constraint then are going to work by showing their explananda to result from metaphysical constraints. So it's because they result from or follow from bits of the natures of the things we're talking about that this constraining role is being played. We can say that results from bit more precisely, although this chunk of text is a little bit ugly. So the idea here more precisely would be something like some fact F results from a metaphysical constraint E if in the nearest, sorry, you all are cutting off my text here and I need it. Shoot. If in the nearest complete world in which F fails to obtain, a fact F star obtains such that F star is logically or metaphysically inconsistent with C, and there's some set of facts obtaining in this world W delta such that F star is logically or metaphysically consistent with delta. So what's going on with this delta? What we need here in effect is just a way to rule out trivializing cases. So if we've got a fact that's just metaphysically impossible, like P and not P, we wouldn't want it to turn out that that results from any constraint whatsoever. This bit about delta is just there to weed out cases like that. So effectively, something results from a metaphysical constraint. If had that not been the case, something inconsistent with the constraint would have been the case instead. So applied to the dishes case here, the fact that there are not two distinct stacks composed of exactly our 5 dishes, I think results from a constraint on composition, that is uniqueness. And we can ask what would have happened had our 5 dishes composed more than one distinct stack. And it seems like in that case, a state of affairs that's logically inconsistent with uniqueness, but not globally inconsistent, would have occurred. If composition exists at all in this weird, impossible situation that we're considering, then it impossibly has a different nature than it actually does. The state of affairs we're describing is inconsistent with the nature of composition. This is a kind of top-down explanation in the sense that it assumes the particular failure of the dishes in my sink to compose more than one distinct stack under a much more general constraint. This metaphysical constraint, explanation by constraint, unifies its explanandum with a range of other possible and actual failures of collections of parts to compose more than one distinct stack. So there's nothing special about the dishes or the process of composition by which it forms a stack. This is a kind of general fact about composition always and everywhere. All right, so there's a lot of interesting work on metaphysical explanation that concerns an alleged explanatory role for metaphysical laws. And some of my more recent work is really interested in understanding how this story is supposed to go. So I want to end the talk by suggesting that this notion of metaphysical constraint can help us to get some traction on the explanatory role that metaphysical laws play. And specifically, I want to argue that the distinction between constraint and coincidence makes some trouble for Jonathan Schaffer's functional account of metaphysical laws. The problem for Schaffer is that I think his functional account is unable to distinguish laws from coincidences, from coincidental generalizations. So the central motivation for Schaffer's view is that it makes laws no more mysterious than functions. So all we need in order to get laws adequate for metaphysical explanation is to get these sorts of mappings from, he says, sources to results. So laws and functions have the same individuation conditions and the same structure. So much as causal explanations need laws of nature, Schaffer and also people like Wilsch and Clement and Glaser assert that grounding explanations need laws of metaphysics. And the idea here is that we need laws to do lots of useful work. Laws need to close explanatory gaps. They help us to unify disparate phenomena. They enable understanding. Then they enable some sort of manipulation. And on Schaffer's functional view, he thinks that determinative explanations in general have a kind of tripartite structure. So we have sources, links, and results. This is a kind of feature of causal explanation where we have causes, causal laws, and effects. And Schaffer thinks it's also the case in grounding explanations, where we have grounds, grounding principles or metaphysical laws, and groundees. So to borrow one of Schaffer's examples, we might wonder, well, why does, say, this particular H2O molecule exist? And Schaffer says, well, because its parts exist, the H and O molecule exists, and the principle of mereological fusion is at work to glom them together to form this H2O molecule. So minimally, Schaffer says, metaphysical laws or links have a kind of structure of functions that just map sources to results. And if we'd like, we can understand these metaphysical laws as just pairs, source-result pairs. He argues that finer individuation, including individuations that appeal to natures or essences, are unnecessary for explanation. All we need is something with the structure of these functions. So I think that if metaphysical laws like the fusion principle explain that it's going to need to be from the top down, that the fusion principle needs to be explanatorily prior to its instances. It's worth saying that I find the explanatory role of links like the fusion principle to be a little bit mysterious. But I think that this is the only sensible way to understand their contribution. In other words, that it doesn't make sense to think about the contribution of laws like the fusion principle from the bottom up. So Schaffer talks about the fusion principle as a machine that melts parts into wholes. And this sort of suggests a determination relation rather than a principle concerning the operation of these kinds of relations. But I think that thinking of, say, the fusion principle as just another ground is confused. It invites a sort of regress. Intuitively, the fusion principle is a principle concerning the operation of fusion. And unless we assume a kind of class nominalism, that's not the relation itself. To say otherwise would include the fusion principle as a ground, and then we would need a link to link that ground to its source. But if that link is also a ground, then we need a further link. It seems like this looks a bit like Carroll's paradox about inference rules. We can also make a comparison to the causal analog. So it would be weird to say that the window broke because it was struck by the ball and the principle of causation is at work, where we're treating both of those things on a par. So to explain then, I think that the fusion principle needs to be prior to its instances. Each instance of fusion follows the principle if each instance of fusion follows the principle each for its own reasons, then it's a kind of coincidence. It's grounded in those reasons. And for the reasons that we talked about before, it's not going to back explanation. It needs instead to be a constraint. So to play the role envisioned for metaphysical laws need to play this sort of explaining, or do this explaining job. To close explanatory gaps, we need to ensure that fusion couldn't have gone differently, such that H and O compose nothing at all. And that requires that it be no coincidence. And then to unify, it needs to be that instances of fusion obey the fusion principle all for the same reason, not each for their own reason. So in other words, it needs to be a constraint. So given that, I think that the functional conception of laws is going to be too coarse-grained to distinguish coincidences from constraints, and so to distinguish genuine laws from mere generalizations. So the distinction between coincidence and constraint concerns why and not whether a given mapping from sources to results hold. So we could imagine the very same mapping being as a constraint in one context and a coincidence in the other. And a purely functional conception isn't going to be able to mark this distinction because it says nothing about why the mapping occurs. It just says that the mapping occurs. So we might want to kind of modal fix here, and Schaffer talks in this way at some points. He talks about metaphysical laws being counterfactually stable. So we might add something like this, but we end up with the same sort of concern that we had before about a modal account of metaphysical explanations by constraint. We have the iterated conception of metaphysical modality, and we also have lots of brute modal claims that we might find undesirable. So I'm interested instead in a kind of essentialist fix, and we'll leave it here. So the thought here might be that laws constrain for the same reason that what I call metaphysical constraints do, namely that they're constitutive parts of the natures of things. And this has a lot in common with other accounts of metaphysical laws that have been worked out by people like Boris Kmen. So the advantage of this might be that explanation in terms of laws looks a lot like another sort of explanation that have been worked out, Glazer's essentialist explanation. And explanations in terms of entailment by the law look like my metaphysical explanations by constraint. So the primary advantage here is that we get a way of understanding the constraining role that's capable of being understood using, you might think, off-the-shelf parts. There's a con, though. It looks like this might commit us to a sort of gnomic essentialism concerning metaphysical laws. I'm not sure whether that's a feature or a bug. So to wrap up, I think much like there are top-down explanations by constraint in science, there's reason to believe that there are metaphysical explanations by constraint that also work from the top down. Not all metaphysical explanations can be understood in terms of metaphysical grounding, pace some grounding theorists. But I do think that metaphysical constraints and metaphysical explanation by constraint can be well understood in terms of natures or essences. And finally, we have maybe an additional condition to attach on the minimal account of metaphysical laws, at least minimal for explanation. It needs to be that metaphysical lawhood is rich enough to distinguish laws that function as constraints from mere mere coincidences. Thank you.